weapons across the line.
Question on the weapons. Well, go ahead, ask a question.
Are you like double counting it? So are we going to turn in the lab, like the file itself, and then you grade on that, and then also just include it in one of them?
Yeah, the kind of the history behind that is that there used to not be that lab, and I found it much more hit or miss for people being successful at the project. So I guess the answer is yes, it's double counting. My intention is that it's double counting to your advantage, right? You do the work once and you get credit twice. And yeah, it's the purpose is just to ensure that people are, one, kind of doing it more stepwise rather than writing 100 lines of code in both classes and then hoping for the best when they type G++. And that at least there's a chunk of the project done, regardless of what happens after.
So does it have to have the same exact output?
The short answer is no. So the grading of the it does in the lab, and I concede that, and I haven't looked at the nitty gritty of the lab in a while. What happens is semester to semester, I just kind of roll with it and we come up with function names, and unfortunately you go to the lab and all of a sudden maybe the function names don't match, is I think the best example. So unfortunately, due to the nature of the lab, you do have to go in lockstep with the interfaces, the function names and class names. When you get to the project, if you're really married to some different naming scheme, that's fine. That isn't being graded on. The design of the weapon is, so for example, the member function for weapon where you are calculating whether or not it hit, that random number has to be generated in that function and the comparison done in that function and true or false returned, as opposed to, say, inside of the knight's attack function doing the random number and the comparison there. So design-wise, it needs to be the same. Naming, it doesn't matter. Any other questions? None? I was afraid of this. I was afraid you're going to make me entertain you this period. Yeah.
I had more of a question. I'm just after the class, or I guess, are there any classes that teach C#, or is C# easily learned after C++? Or?
I'm not. I'll confess, I'm not very familiar with C#, so I don't know. As a general rule, though, there's the vast majority of programming languages you're going to encounter today are going to be derived from C. And I don't mean that in the literal sense that it's like compatible with C, but this idea of a while loop and a for loop and defining functions. And there's the C language got a lot of things right, and people understand that. So you can very easily go to another language, and you'll see a lot of stuff that's familiar. Now, the details will be different. So a good example as a difference between, say, C++ and C# is memory management, and we're not having to deal with memory management in 1.11. But you get to 2.11, and you definitely have to deal with that. In short, there are a lot of things that you want to do in the language, or I should say as programmers in general, where you don't know how much of something you need until the program is actually running. And so if you can't make that decision until the program is running, while the program is running, you have to set aside a chunk of memory. A good example of that, and the details are being hidden, if you think about that vector class, we had a lab, right? You had to do a grocery list or something, and you enter an asterisk. You don't know how many items you need until the program's actually running. And based on what we know about arrays, is you have to do something like string my list, and then I have to choose a number. And the kind of the amateur hour technique is, well, I know that I'm never going to go to the grocery store needing as many as 100 items, so if I make this 100, it'll cover all the likely cases. And I guess there's some truth in that, although if someone then set out to try and crash your program, they just enter 101, 102, 103 items. And in fact, a lot of compromises, security compromises to applications take advantage of that kind of thing. Assumptions made by the programmer, and then the hacker abuses that and causes the thing to crash, and then they can do other things. At any rate, so a vector, so what we were using in that lab was a vector, and we just simply say push back, push back, push back. And if you were to crack open the source code to that vector, you would see that what it'll do is it'll allocate enough room for, say, 10 items. And when you get ready to allocate, to push into that 11th item, it'll see that it's run out of room, and it will, while the program's running, it'll now allocate space for 20 items. It'll copy the first 10 over. It'll then release that 10 because it doesn't need that original, and now it's got 20 with the original 10 here, and now it's got room for 10 more, and then it just repeats when you get to the 30th item and so forth. All of that management has to be done manually by the programmer in C++. It is a very painful thing to do. It's very error prone. In 1.11, the name of the game is syntax errors. In 2.11, 3.11, and on, the name of the game is figuring out why your program's crashing, and it invariably has to do with memory, not dealing with memory correctly. Something like C# has what would be referred to as garbage collection, where it will automatically allocate the memory as you need it, and it'll automatically release it as you don't need it any longer. The advantage to that is you don't have to worry about it. The disadvantage to it is that algorithm is a little bit unpredictable, and if you have the need for speed or actual completely optimized code, you cannot achieve that with a garbage collection mechanism. So I'm getting far afield of your original question, but I think if you go to something like C#, you'll immediately see a lot that's familiar, but the details are definitely different. And I could say that of Python, Java, JavaScript. That's all I know. I don't know. Name a programming language, and it more than likely is going to look very similar to the stuff that we've been doing. Yes?
Do we have to put in round for the project? Do we have to say round 1?
No. It's kind of, I like it, it's nice, but it's definitely not being graded on. And for the sake of the recording, the question was, do you need to print out the round at the beginning of each round, round 1, round 2, round 3, and the answer is no. Other questions?
If we wanted to print the round out, would we put that in the display function? Or would we...
No, I wouldn't put it in the display function. If I was to print out the round, I'd make that part of the code that's in main. So I'd just create an integer counter, start it at 1, and then inside the while loop, make the first thing you do is print out round, and then the value of that counter, and then add 1 to that counter.
Yeah, I tried to do that, but it kept sending my entire program for an infinite loop for some reason. Honestly, I don't know why.
Well, so it'd look like this. Is that big enough? I mean, it's that simple. I should probably throw an end line there as well. What else? Yeah.
So if we don't need to explicitly say round 1, round 2, round 3, we need to just have some indication of where the rounds stop and start.
Because all the text runs together?
Yeah.
Yeah, so what I would do is you've probably got code in here that does something like k1.display, k2.display, right? You have something like that. Then what I would do is I'd do something like this.
And if you do a round number, you can just include that along with the round.
Oh yeah, yeah. So you could absolutely. Yeah, I guess you could either, I have it here as separate lines, but you could very well then do something like, well, hell, you can make it pretty fancy. I suppose you could go this far and then do, well, I'd start here. Right, cut that out. Yeah, that'd be pretty cool right there.
I've got a question. The rubric specifies that we need to use encapsulation and that sort of thing in abstraction. How do we know that we're doing it correctly?
How do you know if you're doing encapsulation and abstraction correctly? The short answer is you basically run with the design that we ferreted out in class. The member functions that we came up with and the behaviors that go in each of those member functions. Key things are that, and I gave an example, I don't know, 2-3 classes ago of breaking encapsulation. There's an item in there that the knight keeps track of whether or not it's on the horse, not any other code. There's some rubric item in there. That's an encapsulation and abstraction subset. So there's an example there. You can go find that screencast to see the details on that. As I mentioned a little bit earlier in this class, what the weapons function for determining whether or not the weapon hit, the random numbers generated in there and the comparisons done in there, it's not done in knight's function. That's another example of properly abstracting behavior where it belongs. Encapsulation is difficult to not do right because you don't know enough to shoot yourself in the foot. If you make all the private data public and start accessing it directly, that would be an example of breaking encapsulation. So I think the bottom line is if you follow the design we came up with in class, you're not going to go wrong. Other questions? Doesn't have to be on Joust. Joust is great. Happy to talk about it. Yes?
Could you explain the get line part again? When we were talking, when you had the night name, you said we should use the get line function instead of just CN.
Yeah, for getting the knight's name. So it's just simply, it's as straightforward as saying string, kname, or whatever you want to call the variable, cout, what is the first knight's name, question mark, get line, cn, kname, cout. Etc.
Should we use like the CN dot clear at all?
Should we use what?
CN dot clear to clear the first line and not ignore. Or is it ignore?
Ignore. You need an ignore if you've input something with the chevrons prior to a get line. The danger is that get line is going to grab a new line that's still waiting to be read in. So let's see. We're going to have. You might have it if you use get line for the weapon type, for instance, and I guess a get line would be good for the weapon type because it isn't just mace, lance, sword. It could also be morning star, which is 2 words, right? Let me emphasize that I'm not hung up on it, and no one's going to grade on it. If you just have CN and chevrons for the knight's name, that'll be fine. I think that the entire thing is a little bit more graceful if you use getLine for the strings. And then it just requires a little bit of understanding of how input streams work, and that if you have some sort of CN chevron prior to this getLine, you're going to need a CN.ignore here to ignore the new line. And I am going to remove these two lines because for those who are doing this project at the last minute, they will copy and paste this code, including that stuff. So I'll just throw it there. At any rate, say knight, K1, then you pass in the knight name, the stamina, 3 more items, and then repeat 5 Q and A for the second knight. And then the rounds begin. Oh man, was that me that I just heard?
Yeah.
Yeah, I hate listening to myself. I talk so slow. Whenever so I actually do some, I usually nowadays will prep for class rather than looking at notes that I did last semester. I'll just play the screencast that I did last semester at this time at double speed. And then whenever I listen to myself at normal speed, it is just so painful. I mean, I think I talk slow enough, even if you're kind of refreshing your memory by looking at one of my screencasts. I'd definitely recommend it at least 1.25, if not 1.5. And then, just pause it and reverse 30 seconds and slow it down to hear that bit. You don't want to listen to whole 50 minutes of me. Taking 50 minutes to listen to 50 minutes of me. You don't want to do that. What else? Yeah.
So we're having the user input all the attributes of the knight and the knight's purpose.
That is absolutely correct. There are 10 CN statements for the 5 attributes of the first knight and the 5 attributes of the second knight. And again, if you go back 2 or 3 screencasts, you will find a technique for speeding that up where you can enter that information in a file and feed that file. Not changing your code, you're not writing file IO code, but from the bash shell, having your program grab information from a file rather than from the keyboard just to speed up testing. So definitely seek out that screencast. I wonder if I made a notation of it. My guess is it's probably week 10 Friday would be my guess is where that is. Yes.
So, I'm sorry, you said we don't have to use getLine for the knight name and the weapon name?
There's no grading requirement to use getLine for the strings. What else? Yeah.
For Joust, how do you make it so the knight stays like on the horse and is exhausted, even when the stamina is not 0, but like they don't have enough stamina to attack?
So the question is, what do you do about the knight when they have a positive stamina greater than 0, however that stamina is less than the stamina required to wield the weapon, correct? And that did come up a while back, and there are two answers. One was a meta answer, and my meta answer was the part of the idea of this project is to have these ambiguities so that I can then wax philosophical about it. And my waxing philosophical about it is, in real project development, you have those questions all the time, and what you have to do is you have to go back to the, whatever you want to call them, the customer, the stakeholder, whoever you're doing the development for, or your manager, and they will. And you have a conversation and you say, look, this is ambiguous, or I don't understand how these two things interact, and you come up with some resolution and move forward. So in the context of the role play where you're programmers for this game company, you'd go talk to the game designers about it, and their answer, which is my direct answer to your question, is that make it so that they can wield the weapon one last time, and then that'll bring the stamina below 0. So it's, you know, a final swing of the sword, after which they're too weak to swing again. Any other questions? Yes?
So, how would you use the night display function to display after each round? And then also,
Okay, the first part of that, how would I use the night display function to display after each round? I have it right there on lines 26 and 27.
and then how would you use the weapons display function to be the night's display?
You have it backward. How would you use the night's display function to invoke the weapons display function, right? So you have a void night : display. You also have class night private. What are you calling your weapon? If you're to crack open the code for your Knight's class declaration, you have a weapon variable. What do you call that variable? Or do you?
Required underscore weapon.
Like that? So the lab that I had you do that provides a model for this is that date time report lab. And there was a report display function. And what you had to do is you had to display the rep date and the rep time, right? So you're starting to see the motivation for me throwing these labs at you, right? They're not just out there in the ether. And again, the reason is so that during that lab, you can get out of your system errors like this. Right? I'm sure that many of you tried to do line 43. Except you would have had something like rep date there, rep date.display in a cout statement. And that doesn't fly, because if you look at the display function and I ask you what does it return, well, it doesn't return anything. It's a void, just like Knight's display is void. So it doesn't make any sense to have absolutely nothing returned from this function and then shove absolutely nothing into cout. That's what the compiler sees, and the compiler vomits. And so that's all you need. You don't do anything with cout. You just call a function, and inside that function are the cout statements. Yes?
I completely forgot how dot display works. Like, what do you need in order to do a dot display? I just completely forgot how it works.
What do you need to do dot display? So the syntax in C++ is you have some sort of object dot behavior. And then there's some input parameters there. So that's the generic syntax. What you need to do, so when I look at, if I look at FDSA dot scrub the car window, the first thing when I see line 49 and I'm looking at someone else's code or some code that I didn't write and I'm not familiar with, the first thing I'm going to do when I see line 49 is I'm going to say, what kind of thing is FDSA? It's an object. It had to have been created. It's a more complex question. Let me do that, right? If I ask you what prints out, the first thing you're going to say, well, what kind of thing is A? Is it an integer? Is it a string? Is it a float? Right? So what kind of thing is FDSA? And then I would hunt around and maybe I see that, FDSA is a widget. Okay. My next question is, what are the legal things that I can do with widget? I need to find a class declaration for widget. So somewhere else, I poke around and I find class widget. And somewhere there's going to be a public. And there's going to be I look, okay, I can call the doohickey class, or function, excuse me, I'm munging up my words here. I can call the doohickey function on any widget I create. I can call the scrum trulescent function, and it takes 2 integers because whenever you call scrum trulescent, you always have to take 2 integers, and in fact, you also have to take a float. I forgot to mention that. All right, so I also can call scrub the car window, and it doesn't take any input parameters. So now I know that line 60 is legal because FDSA is a widget, and I can do lines 51 through 53. Those are the legal things I can do with any widget that I've created, and in fact I have done one of those 3 things there on line 60. So the question to me was, how do you do the dot display stuff with weapon? And first, somewhere there has to have been a weapon object created, and then it's just that object.display. And I know that that's legal because I'll crack open weapon.h, I'll look at the public member functions for weapon, and one of them will be display. I don't know if I answered the question, but if not, ask me in a different way. I'm slow, but I get there eventually. What else you got for me? Yeah.
I'm still having trouble with the round thing. So if you just put it in your while loop, shouldn't that loop it every time?
Did you do it the way I did it?
Yeah, I copied it and it still sent me the definition.
Well, if you remove it, do you have an infinite loop? Are you sure that's the issue with the infinite loop?
Yeah, if I remove it, I don't have it.
Do you have an HDMI socket on your computer?
Yes.
Do you want to do a little live debugging?
Sure.
All right. So the disadvantage is my recording. Let me see, what can I do about the recording here? What I will do is I will leave this recording going. No, because when I pull the plug, the recording will end. I'll end this recording, and then I will record what I do with you on my iPhone, and I'll splice that into the screencast. All right? All right. This is, I'm a little excited. I haven't done this before. Yeah, can you feel it? There's a little electricity in the room. All right, can you all see that better? A little bit.
So I'm sorry, so this is your round variable, right?
Yeah.
All right, so the first thing I would counsel is I would counsel making this a word that is easier to at a glance understand. So I'm going to call it round. Why is there a while loop and a while loop?
Yeah, that's why I was asking. I was like, I don't think I need to.
No, all right. So let's get rid of that. I don't know what that is.
But I got rid of that and still tried to do it, and then it wouldn't. I had it.
All right. So that's exactly right. You ran it and it said round one every time. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So the reason it is doing round one every time, there's the entire loop, is that the loop begins, it's going to create a variable called round and assign it 1 and then print that out. And then add 1 to it, it becomes 2. Come to the bottom of the loop, go back up to the top of the loop. When we hit the bottom, let me ask a general question of the audience. When does a variable die? When does it go out of scope?
At the end of
It,
it.
Right. So let me be clinical about it. A variable goes out of scope. It dies when it hits the closing curly brace of the block it was created in. So in general, round. So let's look at it from a different perspective. K2 is a variable that's been created inside of curly braces, and those curly braces happen to be main. So K2 dies on line 65, which coincidentally is the end of the program, right? If I create a for loop, it doesn't matter, and I create some variable in there, that's going to die on line 50, because that is the ending curly brace of the block it was created in. When I say block, a block is just a term representing a set of curly braces, the code inside of curly braces. All right, so here, this one is going to die on line 61. And then the loop goes up and does it again, and I recreate the variable all over again. And so every time, every single round, it's going to print round 1. What's the solution?
You just pull it to the top.
Create it in a different block, a block higher up, if you will, right? So now this is being created in the block that encapsulates main. So round isn't going to die until main dies, until we hit the end of main. So then this can go away, and oh, did I delete all your, there we go. So let me copy, paste, that goes up there. I delete that one, there we go. And we'll quit. We'll compile. You have a makefile? Yes, you do. And what's it called? It's called main. Main. Oh, do you have you don't have a text file, do you?
No, I usually just use Big Boy on the Mac. It doesn't do spaces.
All right. Little Mac?
Well, yeah.
Is that what you said?
Yeah.
All right. Round 1, round 2, round 3. And we have success. All right, I'll stop this.
Any other questions? Yeah.
When we're done, we send that tarball to you, correct?
Yes, a tarball would be the appropriate thing. Make sure that you don't have any sort of compiled code, right? It's fine to submit like a P4 directory that has all the files, but make sure it just has CPP and H files and a make file. I don't want any .os or executables. Other questions? All right, then I see no reason why I need to keep you here 10 more minutes. Best wishes on the rest of it, and we will pick things up with new and exciting stuff on Monday.